Forget everything you thought you knew about crime bosses. Because the story of the man who became the very emblem of Mexican drug trafficking isn't just a chronicle of illicit acts. It's an epic saga of an improbable ascent from deep poverty to the pinnacle of power, of billions of dollars, of prison breaks worthy of a Hollywood blockbuster, and of how one individual fundamentally transformed the landscape of an entire nation. He was elusive, ruthless, and utterly legendary. His name is Joaquín Guzmán Loera, better known as El Chapo, and his journey serves as a manual for survival and power acquisition in the most brutal of worlds. Joaquín Guzmán Loera, or simply El Chapo, is rightly considered one of Mexico's most notorious criminals, the very embodiment of his country's drug trade. His incredible narrative chronicles a path from an illiterate peasant hailing from the lowest echelons of society to a man whose name echoed globally, the most wanted criminal on the planet. Along this treacherous path, he amassed a multi-billion-dollar fortune, escaped from maximum security prisons twice like an action hero, and became one of the figures who definitively turned Mexico into an arena of brutal cartel clashes, with drug organizations commanding their own armies. If you're curious how a humble farmer from Sinaloa could leave such an indelible mark on history, then it's time to delve into the life of Joaquín Guzmán Loera. Joaquín Archibaldo Guzmán Loera was born on the 4th of April, 1957, in the small village of La Tuna, within the municipality of Badiraguato, to Emilio Guzmán Bustillo and María Consuelo Loera Pérez. He was one of 7 children, with 4 brothers, Miguel, Ángel, Aureliano, Emilio, and Arturo, and 2 sisters, Armida and Bernarda. Like the vast majority of La Tuna's residents, the Guzmán family led an extremely modest existence. Their meager assets consisted only of a few head of livestock, inherited from the future El Chapo's grandparents, which offered them a slight advantage over their more destitute neighbors. Young Joaquín grew up as a short, sturdy boy. It is believed that the nickname El Chapo, meaning the short one, was bestowed upon him by a paternal relative named Pedro Ávila Pérez. However, as is often the case with figures of El Chapo's magnitude, separating the factual details of his early life from myths and legends proves challenging. According to some accounts, El Chapo's father was a deeply flawed and cruel man, prone to alcohol abuse, who reportedly beat the future cartel leader during his childhood and squandered their meager earnings on liquor and prostitutes. Nevertheless, most relatives, in numerous interviews, refuted any abuse by Emilio Guzmán, though they did acknowledge his aversion to labor. The full weight of their family's concerns fell upon María Consuelo, El Chapo's mother. Each day, she toiled to exhaustion, tending their small flock and raising Joaquín with his siblings. It was likely from his mother that El Chapo inherited his industriousness and a desire for order. Even as a child, he had ambitions, María Consuelo recalled in a 2014 interview. I remember he had a pile of homemade paper money. He would count it, then tie it into small stacks. He'd say, "Mom, keep these for me." From childhood, he hoped to become wealthy. El Chapo always remained an affectionate son, even as he rose to become one of Mexico's most notorious drug traffickers. In his most famous interview, he described his relationship with his mother as ideal, filled with respect, affection, and love. For many years, even when he was Mexico's most wanted man, El Chapo regularly returned to La Tuna to visit his mother. As his wealth and status grew, he ensured her comfort. He built a spacious house in the center of La Tuna, where she lived until her passing, and installed a massive water tank on a nearby hill that still supplies the entire village today. During his childhood, El Chapo had to travel approximately 60 kilometers from La Tuna to the nearest school. He learned to read, write, and count, but quickly realized that spending time on daily 120-kilometer round trips for a mediocre education wouldn't yield much money. Further studies required relocating to a larger city and resources his family lacked. Consequently, at around 11 years old, Joaquín's schooling concluded, giving way to his working career. One legend concerning the start of El Chapo's path recounts that his first entrepreneurial endeavor involved selling oranges and bread on the busy road between La Tuna and Huajicoripa. According to his sister, with his initial earnings, he purchased the indispensable accessory of a respectable boss, albeit a fake one, a gold chain. Every Sunday, he would wear it, visit relatives, and chat with neighbors. The cheap gold-plated chain left a green mark on his neck, but that hardly mattered. Throughout his childhood and early youth, Joaquín worked, helping his mother manage the household and trading on the road. When he was between 11 and 12 years old, he began assisting his father, whose business was rather unique. His father, though formerly considered a cattle rancher, was one of thousands of gomeros, farmers who cultivated opium. There's a separate history detailing how Mexico, by the mid-20th century, became a major supplier of narcotic crops. For now, it suffices to remember that the Mexican Golden Triangle, the states of Sinaloa, Chihuahua, and Durango, had cultivated cannabis for several centuries. For impoverished local farmers, it was advantageous to supplement their food crops with plots of marijuana and later opium poppy, which fetched a much higher price than tomatoes and beans. By the 20th century, a unique subculture had even formed around these growers, and the producers and harvesters were known as gomeros. The First World War catalyzed the opium business, initiating the process of state and drug trafficking intertwining. By the time El Chapo was born in 1957, drug trafficking was, in essence, a state-controlled industry, and a particular social order was associated with it. At the bottom were the peasant gomeros, at the top were politicians eager for large sums of money, and in between circulated intermediaries whose success depended on the favor of the elites. This arrangement provided a certain stability, allowing farmers with money from raw material sales to at least clothe their children for school. And each of them, with ambition and connections, had a chance to enter this business which for a period remained family-run. The very structure of the state relied on the stability ensured by these relationships. The Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, which governed Mexico as a de facto one-party state from 1929 to 2000, maintained a facade of democracy, holding power in nearly every sector of government. However, in some areas of the country, such as the highlands of Sinaloa, anarchy created by numerous drug trafficking groups reigned, and the state had to assert its presence through brute force. When El Chapo was a teenager, he witnessed firsthand the violence the government inflicted upon poor areas where illicit crops were grown. On the 8th of February, 1975, 3 Army helicopters landed near La Tuna. Descending from the aircraft, soldiers and police officers unleashed a veritable massacre in the village. Unable to find men to arrest, the soldiers beat women and shot at teenagers. When a group of victims found the courage to travel to Culiacán to protest this lawlessness, officials published a different version of events in the press. The soldiers, they claimed, had been attacked by villagers. In a 2018 interview, El Chapo's younger sister, Bernarda, described those years as very frightening and recalled sitting in the dark while soldiers stomped around outside. According to her, Joaquín had confrontations with soldiers during that period. Thus, according to many biographers, any hope El Chapo might have had of directing his ambitions toward legal endeavors was ripped away by the soldiers. The abuses by authorities showed him that individuals like himself were left to their own devices and had to carve out their path in this cruel world by any means available. The world in which El Chapo was born and raised involved local officials controlling opium and marijuana cultivation. But by the time his drug trafficking career began, the old order was already crumbling, as federal authorities sought to limit the autonomy of the Sierra Madre's residents in their drug operations, and began contemplating how to wrest control of the lucrative trade from local caporales, or warlords. The raids in La Tuna and other Sierra villages in the mid-1970s served as a warning of what was to come. In his youth, for El Chapo, cultivating prohibited crops was a family affair, passed down from father to son. At every level, from producers to smugglers, the business operated along clan lines, and names like Carrillo, Quintero, Payan, Fernandez, and later Guzman reappeared over the decades as one generation succeeded another. So El Chapo's path, in essence, was predetermined even before the clashes with federal agents. He entered the business alongside his lazy but kind father, working as a harvester in poppy and marijuana plantations in the mountains around La Tuna. Everyone worked. Every morning at dawn, the children over 11 years old would ascend the hillsides to the poppy fields and begin harvesting. 1 kilogram of resin would earn the family approximately 8,000 pesos or $700 in today's money. Throughout this time, the mother and daughters prepared lunch, which the younger children would then load onto their backs and carry to their brothers at the start of the day. In addition to cultivation, Emilio Guzman also handled negotiations for selling the harvest to the next link in the chain, and the collected opium was sent to Culiacan or another nearby city like Guamuchil. Today, this industry functions in much the same way. Chapo's father was, in a sense, fortunate to have connections with respected individuals in the Sinaloa capital through his relative Pedro Avilés Perez, one of the first known smugglers of the Sierra Madre. By the time he started working in the fields, at around 12 years old, El Chapo, as mentioned, had definitively left school. For many years, rumors circulated that he was illiterate, but this is an exaggeration. However, in letters written by El Chapo, one can indeed observe irregular handwriting and numerous spelling errors. This deficiency, however, in no way hindered his advancement in drug trafficking, which demands knowledge and skills of a rather different nature than those taught in school. At approximately 20 years of age, El Chapo moved from La Tuna to the town of Badiraguato, where he grew close to the Beltran Leyva brothers, Arturo, Hector, Alfredo, Carlos, and Mario. They had grown up near La Tuna and for several decades would become his closest collaborators. In time, El Chapo also outgrew Badiraguato, and after a couple of years, he moved to Culiacan, fully immersing himself in the work. Myths and legends abound concerning the early years of El Chapo's drug trafficking career. For example, it is still uncertain whether El Chapo was related to Pedro Avilés Perez, and even if he was, it's unclear whether he worked for him. But this perspective is shared by many researchers. In the 1970s, Avilés was a key player in Sinaloa, possessing many valuable connections within the political elite and rapidly building his career. He was a pioneer of drug aviation. It was Avilés who conceived of transporting goods by plane. There is also a version that El Chapo worked as a driver for a former police officer named Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo and carried out delicate, unspoken assignments for him. However, El Chapo's exact early associates are not as important as the crucial lesson he quickly learned from all options for potential patrons. In the dark world, one must always stay close to the strongest and constantly assert one's authority, expanding spheres of influence by any available means. In 1977, at about 20 years old, El Chapo married Alejandrina Maria Salazar Hernandez for the first time. They had 3 children, Cesar, Ivan Archibaldo, and Jesus Alfredo. Their marriage did not last long. A second marriage followed, also quickly dissolved, and a third, with Griselda Lopez Perez, with whom he had another 4 children, Edgar, Joaquín, Ovidio, and Griselda Guadalupe. It is unclear if he officially divorced his wives, but this never prevented him from remarrying again and again. And certainly, none of the women ever hampered his career. By the late 1970s, the ambitious and pragmatic Chapo, alongside Palma Salazar, was transporting what were then rather large quantities of marijuana across the northern border, but he wanted more. Indeed, there were many transporters like him, and he ardently desired to become a major player. Even in his youth, El Chapo understood the importance of family and friendly ties, and preferred to work with people who had started with him in Badiraguato. Even better if they were bound by blood or marriage. At a pivotal moment in the late 1970s, El Chapo was rapidly ascending, entering a new cohort of Sinaloa traffickers in the nascent Guadalajara cartel. His closest partners included the Beltran Leyva brothers, Hector, Arturo, and Alfredo, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, a man 10 years older than El Chapo, born south of Culiacan, and also Hector Luis Palma Salazar, known as El Güero, the blonde one, for his fair skin. He was a former car thief and hitman with the detached gaze of Macaritas in Sinaloa. These individuals continued to work together for decades and later formed the leadership of the group now widely known as the Sinaloa Cartel. In the late 1970s, Chapo also began working at full capacity under the tutelage of the future boss of bosses, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. His intuition did not deceive him. It was Gallardo who would soon make them all rich. In the nascent Guadalajara cartel, which was still based in their home state of Sinaloa, Chapo was responsible for logistics in his section along the northern border, while his old friend Palma Salazar ensured that deliveries were safely made overland to clients in the United States. According to Gallardo's philosophy, which El Chapo fully embraced, none of the organization's participants should attract attention, and for a time, they succeeded. But the U.S. operation dubbed Condor literally shattered the world in which El Chapo had grown up. In those years, when he dedicated himself to drug trafficking, Mexico was under increasing pressure from the United States, which demanded a crackdown on opium and marijuana production and trafficking. Operation Condor swept many old-generation drug traffickers off the map, especially those who had begun attracting attention from the United States, including Pedro Avilés, whose name surfaced in dozens of DEA investigations and became a potential embarrassment for politicians in Mexico City. In 1978, Avilés died in a shootout, and Gallardo filled the vacant boss position. But it was too hot in Sinaloa, so they set out to conquer Guadalajara. Much could be said about Félix Gallardo, but for El Chapo's story, it's sufficient to note, among all the young drug traffickers, Miguel Ángel became the boss of bosses precisely because he had many useful contacts in high circles. After studying and working in the police, he ended up in the guard of the governor of Sinaloa, Leopoldo Sánchez Celis. Sánchez Celis was closely tied to drug traffickers, acting as an intermediary between his political PRI bosses and selected drug traffickers who were permitted to operate in Sinaloa. Félix Gallardo left the police in the early 1970s to become a full-time drug trafficker, working with Pedro Avilés and rapidly assuming power after his death in 1978. Now that everything was run by federal police rather than local authorities, Félix Gallardo naturally became the trusted intermediary between drug traffickers and the government. And in the dark world, Gallardo's trump card turned out to be his friend, the powerful Honduran Juan Ramón Mata Ballesteros, through whom he connected with the leaders of cocaine cartels in Colombia. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo found himself in the right place at the right time, with the right connections and remarkable ambition. It's no surprise that young El Chapo joined him. Therefore, Chapo's drug trafficking career, usually described as a typical manager's advancement into leadership, is not so straightforward. Initially, everyone in Guadalajara was more or less equal, and ultimately, everything depended on connections not within Mexico, but outside of it. A native of La Tuna village with 3 years of education could not yet possess such connections. Beyond the intricacies of diplomacy during the Guadalajara years, Chapo learned several shrewd business decisions from Félix Gallardo. First, to remain inconspicuous, to be discreet, while simultaneously cultivating mutually beneficial relationships with the political elite. Second, to always be one step ahead. Wiretaps, personal communication channels, security, hideouts. Gallardo, obsessed with gadgets, was already spending tens of thousands of dollars on state-of-the-art radio equipment in the early 1980s and acquiring properties around Culiacán and Guadalajara, posing as a hotel industry magnate. Together with Gallardo, the group of promising young men from Sinaloa settled in Guadalajara, the capital of the central state of Jalisco and Mexico's primary financial and banking center outside of Mexico City. His two main collaborators at that time were drug trafficking veteran Ernesto Don Neto Fonseca Carrillo and the drug prince, Rafael Rafa Caro Quintero, a descendant of a long line of drug traffickers. Félix Gallardo, Don Neto, and Caro Quintero are recognized as the leaders of the Guadalajara network, but alongside them, countless other Sinaloa traffickers ensured the business ran. And among this influx of Sinaloans to Guadalajara and other areas outside the Golden Triangle was also the young El Chapo. While Félix Gallardo built an empire on Colombian cocaine and established ties with Guadalajara's political and social elite, El Chapo, then around 27 years old, headed to Zacatecas, a state located in the heart of the country. At the center of Zacatecas, north of the state capital, lies Fresnillo. In the early 1980s, it became a hub for marijuana trade, as traffickers and drug producers flocked there from Sinaloa following Operation Condor. El Chapo arrived in Zacatecas in 1984, accompanied by his old friend and associate Arturo Beltran Leyva, and also a cousin from La Tuna. At that time, an enormous number of loosely connected gangs created a vast network of large marijuana plantations northeast of Fresnillo. Although some farms belonged to local Zacatecas drug traffickers, the largest operations were funded directly by Caro Quintero and Don Nato, managed by mid-level managers working on their behalf. Among these mid-level operators in Zacatecas was a Sinaloa native named Juan José de Paragoza Morena, whom everyone called El Azul, or the Blue One, because his skin was so dark, even for Mexico, that it seemed to have a bluish tint. He hailed from the village of Huajicoripa, located in the valley leading to El Chapo's hometown. It was on the very road between Huajicoripa and La Tuna that young Chapo had begun his business journey. El Azul was nearly 10 years older than El Chapo, and at that time held a solid position and authority within the cartel, and in parallel, he was building a career in the DFS, which had always been the main source of political protection for the Guadalajara traffickers. The DFS was a shadowy secret police force that acted as the regime's executive arm and existed to ensure the political stability of the PRI government. Just as Felix Gallardo and his friends benefited from their ties to the DFS also had its friends in high circles, including the CIA. Despite its clear involvement in criminal activities, the DFS and its drug-related assets and capabilities were useful to American interests in the fight against omnipresent communists. Almost every member of Guadalajara had, in one way or another, dirty hands with their CIA friends, and Caro Quintero even had an American training camp on his territory. So, in the 1980s, a few kilometers north of Fresnillo, El Azul was developing a 2,000-hectare marijuana plantation. It was under his wing that El Chapo and Arturo Beltran Leyva began working, marking the start of a long and fruitful relationship among the three. The cultivation and processing of marijuana and poppy have always been labor-intensive processes. Marijuana needs space to grow, and poppy must be carefully cut to extract its latex. In Zacatecas, veritable armies of laborers from Culiacan worked, and the business boomed. But a new era was dawning, the era of Colombian cocaine, which offered numerous advantages from a production and logistical standpoint. Far fewer workers were needed to handle the loads. And, unlike in El Chapo's youth, not just anyone from Sinaloa could enter the business anymore. This required international contacts, like those Felix Gallardo maintained through his Honduran friend Mata Ballesteros. Mexicans became the transporters of cocaine for the Colombians, and where there's cocaine, there's a lot of money. The collaboration scheme between Mexicans and Colombians became known as the Mexican trampoline, as cocaine bricks arrived from Colombia, landed in Mexico, and continued their journey to the United States. For Mexican drug traffickers, cocaine became a true godsend. No headaches over growing seasons, irrigation, and land, just delivery. The profit margin on cocaine was astounding. Mexican traffickers could earn tens of times more than from their own opium and marijuana, the popularity of which was fading. And, naturally, El Chapo couldn't help but want to enter such a lucrative industry. In the 1980s, the Guadalajara cartel experienced both its rise and fall. Gallardo's empire ceased to exist as the Guadalajara cartel after the murder of DEA agent Kiki Camarena. Miguel Angel made a truly fateful decision to divide his organization into plazas, entrusting management to the best of the best. In practice, he privatized Mexican drug trafficking and opened his own distribution market. But he also sent his creation back underground to be run by less-known bosses who had not yet fallen into American crosshairs. None of them were involved in Camarena's murder. None had a long and well-known history of criminal activity. All of them could develop new ties with the Mexican political system and police, and if they stayed put, maintaining their areas, they could control the business even more tightly. According to one version, El Padrino, Gallardo, gathered the country's main drug traffickers in a house in the southern resort town of Acapulco and outlined his plans for the future. The division was rather simple. The Tijuana route was to go to the Arellano Felix brothers. Ciudad Juarez, with its crucial transportation routes to Texas, remained with the Carrillo Fuentes family. Rafael Caro Quintero's brother, Miguel, received Sonora, in other words, the key route through Arizona. On Mexico's northeastern coast in Matamoros, Juan Garcia Abrego retained control of all operations. El Chapo was present at that meeting. He and El Mayo were assigned northern Sinaloa. Chapo was given the Tecate corridor. The friends were to smuggle drugs into Arizona and parts of California. For Chapo, such trust was true recognition. He had finally become a major boss. Although not as profitable a plaza as Carrillo's, still significant, Felix Gallardo still planned to control major operations. He had the contacts, so he was still the boss. But now the business was more diversified. On the 14th of April, 1989, El Padrino arrived at a friend's house in Guadalajara for lunch with an acquaintance, a high-ranking police officer named Guillermo Calderoni, where he was arrested. Gallardo is still in prison and continues to accuse Calderoni of betrayal. Immediately after his capture, rumors began to circulate that he had been betrayed by his own people. In the early 1990s, Chapo undoubtedly ordered the elimination of several of El Padrino's loyal collaborators and lawyers, which fueled the widespread belief that Chapo had betrayed his mentor. But El Padrino never commented on such suppositions, stating that the corrupt policeman Calderoni had betrayed him. Mexico thus transformed into a veritable powder keg. And the question was, who would light the first spark? 2 years passed since El Padrino's arrest, and in 1991, serious conflicts began. The story, as always, is complex and winding. Journalist Jesus Blanc-Cornejo recounted the beginning of the collapse as follows. Rigoberto Campas, a former DFS agent, had a falling out with Don Chuy Labra, the boss of Tijuana, and began encroaching on Sinaloa, Tijuana, Mexicali, San Luis Rio Colorado, and Tecate, causing problems for the owners of these plazas. El Chapo, El Güero Palma Salazar, and the Arellano Felix brothers decided to oust the troublesome player from the business, organizing Campas's kidnapping. They threw him into a shredder. Miraculously, he survived, albeit without arms, and continued, as if nothing had happened, to move freely across all territories, reorganizing his business. On the 1st of March, 1991, Arellano and Chapo invited Campas for a discussion in Tijuana, and then, as he left, ambushed him. Rigoberto Campas's truck was hit by more than 600 bullets. The message was crystal clear. No one could enter Tijuana without the permission of the Arellano Felix family, El Chapo, and El Güero Palma. They were still formally friends and allies, but their friendship did not last long in the face of the temptations of territorial expansion. By the late 1980s, a loyal Chapo collaborator named Camarena Macias purchased properties on both sides of the border and began digging a tunnel connecting his ranch in Mexican territory to a warehouse on the American side of Arizona. The tunnel was a marvel of engineering. The entrance on the Mexican side was in a billiard room. The pool table on a hydraulic platform served as the entrance, opening with the flick of a hidden switch. Inside the tunnel, a rope-drawn trolley moved goods approximately 60 meters north to the other end of the tunnel, which opened into a warehouse on the American side, where another hydraulic platform, disguised as a drainage grate, concealed the exit. El Chapo had a veritable pipeline, literally pouring cocaine into the United States. Soon, the tunnel became the primary route through which El Chapo sent cocaine into the United States. More than 3 metric tons passed through it each month. But in Sonora, Guzmán Loera's presence was noted not only by Camarena Macias. From around 1987, El Chapo's men began settling in Agua Prieta and its environs, turning it into one of their main bases along the U.S. border. Being within their control zone, it was far from border crossings controlled by other groups, yet still offered a direct supply line to the United States, just a few hours' drive from Phoenix and Tucson. The team running the Agua Prieta operation included El Chapo's brother, Arturo Guzmán, nicknamed El Pollo, and the Beltrán Leiva brothers. By one estimate, between 1988 and 1991, El Chapo and his team smuggled 35 metric tons of cocaine across the Arizona border. To deliver drugs to the border, the gang opened a landing strip in Compass, Sonora, about 100 miles south of the border, where Arturo Guzman and the Beltran Leyva brothers were responsible for receiving drug shipments from planes, unloading the goods, and transporting them north to the Agua Prieta border crossing point. After selling the shipments in Arizona, they smuggled the cash back into Mexico. To meet the sudden demand for cash, numerous currency exchange offices appeared in the city. The man in charge of this massive operation was a pilot named Miguel Ángel Martínez, a former smuggler who had started working for El Chapo in 1986. Martínez transported several shipments of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico for El Chapo. But after a few months, his career as a pilot smuggler ran aground on a dirt airstrip in Durango State, where Martínez landed abruptly nose first. El Chapo took the accident calmly, but no longer wished to entrust his life or his valuable cargo to Martínez's flying skills. Mr. Guzman told me I was a bad pilot, and he didn't want me to continue working for him as a pilot, Martínez later recalled. Assuming he was fired, Martínez thanked his boss for the opportunity, but El Chapo told him there had been a misunderstanding. He wasn't firing Martínez, rather, he was promoting him. So Martínez failed his promotion as a pilot, but became a drug air traffic controller, coordinating an endless stream of planes arriving from Colombia laden with cocaine bricks. He communicated with the boss via high-frequency radio using codes. Wine meant jet fuel. Girls were planes, documents were money, and the precious cocaine cargo they called shirts. Between 1987 and 1991, shipments arrived on a small fleet of planes, each carrying hundreds of kilograms of cocaine. In the late 1980s, the main connections of Chapo's organization in Colombia were members of the Cali Cartel, the Ochoa family, and Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha. Pilot Miguel Ángel Martínez often traveled to Colombia to meet Rodriguez Gacha and other suppliers, and sometimes El Chapo joined him to pay respects and add a personal touch to the business. But El Chapo and his allies were not content to stop there and wished to expand, especially after Escobar's exploits and the death of one of the major suppliers, Rodriguez Gacha. In early 1990, El Chapo established new business relationships that made him richer than he had ever imagined. His new contact was a young Colombian drug trafficker named Juan Carlos Ramirez Abadia. Ramirez, who went by the nickname Chupeta, or Lollipop, was only 27 years old at the time, but was already an emerging leader of the Cali Cartel faction that would soon become known as the Norte del Valle Cartel. The two promising traffickers met for the first time in a Mexico City hotel in 1990. The prevailing rate most Mexican smugglers charged for transporting Colombian cocaine was 37% per shipment, but El Chapo entered the market with a firm deal. He wouldn't accept less than 40%. In exchange for the additional 3%, El Chapo promised that he would not only smuggle the cocaine faster than other smugglers, but also guarantee its security while under his control, and would reimburse Chupeta for anything lost in Mexico. Chupeta took the risk, and was not wrong. In less than 1 week, El Chapo's men transported the first shipment of 4,000 kilograms from the landing point in Mexico to its destination in Los Angeles, whereas other traffickers usually took a month or even longer. From then on, the Colombians gave the young Chapo of Sinaloa a new name, El Rapido, meaning the fast one. The key to El Chapo's speed, to his reputation as El Rapido, was precisely that tunnel in Sonora. It allowed him to move enormous batches of goods under the border all at once, instead of dividing them into smaller batches that could be transported hidden in vehicles. After the cocaine was smuggled under the border, warehouse workers on the American side packed it into hidden compartments of cars and trucks and transported it north to Phoenix, the hub from which it was shipped to distribution points across the country. And thanks to El Chapo's connections with corrupt Mexican security forces, he proved more reliable than his competitors. El Chapo, still unburdened by widespread fame, began to enjoy the fruits of his labor. He had grown up in poverty, and in those early years, relative anonymity allowed the poor boy from La Tuna to see the world. Using numerous false passports, El Chapo, accompanied by Martínez, traveled throughout Latin America and made trips to Southeast Asia, both for business and pleasure. El Chapo even went to Switzerland for stem cell injections, wanting to remain young for as long as possible. El Chapo owned a $10 million house in Acapulco. At his ranch in Guadalajara, he built a zoo and populated it with lions, tigers, panthers, and deer. Chapo's organization's properties were scattered across Mexico. In many major cities, a system of safe houses existed. Inside each house, one could often find dozens of machine guns, grenades, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Chapo also acquired ranches throughout Mexico, but especially in Sinaloa, Sonora, Chihuahua, and Durango. There, local gomeros cultivated poppy and marijuana. Chapo loved to delegate authority so he could enjoy his wealth without worrying about the details of every drug deal. Staff recruitment occurred locally through trusted individuals. The recruit was introduced to the local boss. The boss then reported to another boss, and so on up the hierarchical ladder. Chapo always remained in the shadows, and few met him in person. People in Chapo's cells mostly stayed in place, overseeing operations in their area. Their main task was to receive, protect, and distribute Chapo's drugs to the next links in the chain. They also carried out killings on their boss's orders. Even though they worked for Chapo, they sometimes took on extra work, organizing, for example, car theft and counterfeit goods trafficking. As long as the workers didn't attract attention, their activities were forgiven. Even in Sinaloa, Chapo didn't object to a little extra work. Apparently, he allowed everyone to operate, provided they paid him tribute. All actions, the reception of shipments and cash transactions, and unpaid debts were recorded in ledgers. Cell operators were provided with fake identification documents and sometimes armored vehicles. They usually communicated by radio. Later, cell phones came into use. Chapo corrupted high-ranking officials at telecommunication companies to ensure that the phones used by his men did not appear in the central database. Each member of the organization received a cell phone and a code with which they could identify themselves. El Chapo's team transported tens of thousands of kilograms of cocaine annually, with a street value amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars, pocketing the profit from 4 out of every 10 kilograms. And Martinez estimated that 95% of this passed through the tunnel. But Agua Prieta was a small town, and local customs officials soon heard about suspicious activity around Camarena Macias's warehouse. On the 9th of May, 1990, federal agents on the outskirts of Phoenix seized a truck full of cocaine and managed to link it to the warehouse. On the 17th of May, customs agents conducted a search and discovered the tunnel. Martinez later recalled receiving a call from the boss after the raid. El Chapo was furious that his main smuggling route had been exposed, along with millions of dollars in cocaine. And he thought he knew who the culprit might be, not suspecting customs surveillance. Many stories exist about how El Chapo killed employees and meted out cruel punishments for minor transgressions, but many of these are difficult to verify. He, of course, with the growth of the organization, began to enforce discipline through violence, but at that time, he could be a surprisingly lenient boss. As angry as El Chapo was with Camarena Macias, he allowed him to flee, saving his life. The federal agents who discovered the tunnel were astonished by its complexity. And, despite its short lifespan, the tunnel proved to be a valuable experiment for El Chapo. It was not his last tunnel, but in drug trafficking, one cannot rest on one's laurels. And at the moment, El Chapo had a problem. He had too much cocaine on hand to reliably move it in trucks passing through legal ports of entry. The delay threatened to tarnish El Chapo's reputation with the Colombians, and not just with them. The growing ambitions of Chapo and his team could not go unnoticed by those crowned kings by Felix Gallardo. The Arellano brothers were the first. They ordered the killing of El Mayo Zambada, who was smuggling Colombian cocaine through Tijuana, but for some reason was not paying the plaza's owners, owing them, according to Ramon's calculations, $20 million. The Arellanos accused him, and although he admitted the debt, he claimed he had no money, but the business did not cease. Ramon, enraged, ordered his assassination in 1990, but El Mayo escaped and joined the organization led by El Chapo. The debt, meanwhile, had grown, setting the stage for Tijuana versus Sinaloa. And here, many researchers agree that it was El Chapo who was responsible for starting the war. The conflict between Sinaloa and Tijuana would last almost until the end of the first decade of this century. For nearly 2 decades, the violence would be primarily in Baja California, especially in the city of Tijuana, and would extend to Jalisco and Sinaloa. In early 1992, El Chapo sent men to invade Tijuana to reclaim the plazas. Ramon Arellano's reaction, leading the armed wing, was decisive. In response, he hired a group of assassins from San Diego's 31st Street gang. They captured, executed, and dumped 6 Sinaloa fighters on the street. Shortly thereafter, Ramon sent his group to plant a car bomb in Culiacan, near El Chapo's safe house, where El Mayo was supposed to be. There were no deaths or injuries, but the warning was crystal clear. In October of that same year, Ramon himself, with the help of 2 of his trusted men, attempted to assassinate Chapo as he drove along a Guadalajara avenue. Guzman's experience and knowledge of the city's alleys allowed him to escape. After the assassination attempt, Benjamin Arellano personally called Chapo to swear he was unaware of the attack and that their agreement still held firm. And on the 8th of November, 1992, El Chapo retaliated. 2 of the Arellano Felix brothers, Francisco Javier and Ramon, went to the resort town of Puerto Vallarta in Jalisco State to relax. In the evening, they went to the popular Cristina nightclub, where 15 of El Chapo's men burst in. Spotting the Arellanos, they began firing in all directions. The brothers' bodyguards returned fire, and a shootout ensued. Francisco and Ramon miraculously managed to hide, but 6 people died that night, including innocent club patrons. Mutual attacks continued until mid-May 1993, when another team of hitmen led by Francisco Javier Arellano Felix arrived in Guadalajara. Chapo was very cautious, and the Arellano Felix brothers never succeeded in their objective. After several days of searching for Chapo, Francisco Javier and the assassins decided to return home. On the 24th of May, Javier was checking in for his return flight to Tijuana when he heard the news. Chapo was in the airport parking lot, about to board an afternoon flight to Puerto Vallarta. The gunmen immediately rushed out, found Chapo, and began firing. Chapo's group returned fire. The Arellanos' men noticed a car they believed belonged to Chapo, a white Mercury Grand Marquis, and opening the door, began flooding the interior with bullets. But Chapo was not in that car. He was seated in a dark green Buick sedan nearby. In the Mercury Grand was Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo, Archbishop of Guadalajara. Amidst the chaos and confusion, Chapo successfully slipped away from the crime scene, got into a taxi, and headed to a safe location. The Cardinal died on the spot from 14 bullet wounds. Meanwhile, Francisco Javier Arellano Felix took a first-class seat on the plane to Tijuana and flew away. The fact that Chapo escaped his assassins did not change the face of the drug war, but the accidental or non-accidental death of Cardinal Posadas Ocampo changed everything. The state placed a $5 million bounty on Joaquín Guzmán Loera's head. Chapo fled to Mexico City and remained there for 2 days. There, he met a collaborator to whom he handed over approximately $200 million to secure his family in case of arrest. To another trustee, he handed over roughly the same amount to ensure the stable operation of the organization. He was then taken to southern Chiapas, where Guzmán Loera had established a network for his drug operations in Guatemala a few months prior. For this reason, upon his arrival, he contacted a Guatemalan Army lieutenant colonel. Chapo paid the lieutenant colonel $1.2 million. In return, the narco baron and his accomplices, 4 men and Chapo's girlfriend, were able to hide in Guatemala. Chapo also had a fake passport. He now traveled under the name of Jorge Ramos Perez. On the 31st of May, just 1 week after the Guadalajara airport shooting, police received information that Chapo was in Guatemala. Soldiers and federal agents were dispatched there. At dawn on the 9th of June, Guatemalan troops surrounded the area where Chapo and his accomplices were hiding. They arrested him and handed him over to the Mexicans at noon on the same day. Chapo had been betrayed. At that time, pressure from the United States and involvement in foreign anti-drug operations were at their peak. American special forces and Colombian military were closing in on Pablo Escobar in Medellin. He was killed in December 1993. Information exchange between Central and South American countries, Mexico and the United States, had reached unprecedented levels. This might explain why the Guatemalans were willing to disregard the agreement made with Chapo and arrest him. The Mexicans stated that only such cooperation had made the capture possible. Once in the hands of the Mexican military, Chapo began to talk. He revealed his contacts in Colombia and the extent of his corruption network in Mexico. Shortly after the arrest, one of the officials he named was found dead, and another was arrested. El Chapo also spoke about the Arellano Felix brothers. If the failed assassination attempt on El Chapo was the defining moment of 1993, his revelations to the military about the Arellano Felix brothers shattered the bonds of secrecy between cartels, which were never re-established. The brothers also became major public enemies. Francisco Arellano Felix, the elder brother, was captured on the 4th of December, 1993. He was incarcerated in a maximum security prison. The other Arellano Felix brothers retaliated, but this time without weapons. They sent a letter to the Pope outlining their version of events in Guadalajara, claiming that the assassins were Chapo's militants who had mistaken the cardinal for Ramon Arellano Felix. The confrontation between El Chapo and the Arellano Felix brothers sparked a war that has since spread nationwide. Mexican drug trafficking would no longer be managed by a cohesive group of friends and family from Sinaloa. Disputes would almost never again be resolved at the negotiating table. They would be settled with bloodshed. A cartel colluding with authorities to oust another cartel would become a common phenomenon. The main players, the Sinaloa, Tijuana, Juarez, and Gulf cartels, would recruit new groups of enforcers for their dirty work, and these, in turn, would betray their former bosses after tasting power. Never again would the Mexican drug industry be merely a criminal enterprise. From now on, it would be kill or be killed, a murky and chaotic world of distrust, mythology, and money, $40 billion annually by some estimates. The events of 1993, the war with the Arellanos, the arrest, the airport clash, definitively elevated Chapo to an undisputed and ruthless leader. Over the next 2 decades, his reputation would soar. Even in prison, his status would increase as stories of him living like a king behind bars would spread widely and new tunnels would be discovered along the southwestern U.S. border. Thus, Joaquín Guzmán Loera was found guilty of drug trafficking and corruption and sentenced to 20 years in prison. 1 year later, he was also convicted of the Archbishop's murder, though another judge later overturned that decision. With the exception of Francisco Arellano Felix, arrested in December 1993 in Tijuana, the other Arellano Felix brothers were more fortunate, and most of them managed to evade the bounties on their heads. However, they were forced into hiding for many years after the Guadalajara shooting. El Chapo's incarceration did not significantly impact the war, which continued unabated. And while the war raged outside, Chapo began to settle into prison life. As soon as he arrived at Puente Grande, the maximum security prison on the outskirts of Guadalajara, he began to spend money lavishly, corrupting anyone he could to ensure his comfort. For example, the prison cook received a substantial $1,000 a month for preparing special dishes, and guards earned $4,000. El Chapo had always possessed an insatiable sexual appetite, and this did not change during his detention at Puente Grande, where he arranged conjugal visits with his wives and often spent time in the prison's women's wing. But of course, El Chapo's plans did not involve simply languishing in prison. El Chapo had to ensure his affairs outside the prison walls ran smoothly. His outside contact became the loyal Miguel Ángel Martínez. Immediately after the Guadalajara airport shooting, Martínez fled to Europe, where he remained for about 6 weeks until the situation in Mexico calmed down. El Chapo trusted Martínez implicitly and gave him many instructions. Specifically, he was to meet El Azul and negotiate the sale of a large shipment. At the meeting, Martínez discovered that Amado Carrillo Fuentes had also joined El Azul. The weight of the goods Chapo wanted to sell, and as quickly as possible, amounted to approximately 3 metric tons. All of this was stored in warehouses. Martinez recalled that El Azul was stunned by such a quantity. He rolled his eyes and said, "You scare me with all these figures," Martinez remembered. Azul asked for time to think. Thus, Martinez learned that friendship is friendship, but money is money, even in drug trafficking. El Azul and El Chapo, of course, were old friends and often worked together, but still that shipment was too large. And Paragosa Morena had to calculate everything to decide if it was worth getting involved for friendship with El Chapo, who was beginning to be written off. However, after the meeting with Arturo Guzmán, Azul agreed to transport the shipment, but when the cargo traveled north in a molasses tanker car, the DEA seized it at the Mexicali border crossing. In Colombia, El Chapo's suppliers began to worry. Chupeta, the head of the Norte del Valle cartel, was furious. Within a few months, his main client in Mexico had been arrested, and Mexican and U.S. authorities had seized more than 10 metric tons of their cocaine. The situation was resolved by Arturo Guzmán in a phone call, promising that the Mexican side would fully compensate for the loss. On El Chapo's side, the Beltran Leyva brothers and El Güero Palma still remained. But El Güero did not stay free for long. On the 23rd of June, 1995, he was on his way to a wedding party when his plane crashed. According to a DEA agent who had seen photos of the crash, it was a miracle anyone survived. Palma was captured severely injured, emerging from the jungle accompanied by federal police. He soon joined El Chapo, as a warrant for his arrest on drug trafficking charges had long been issued in Mexico. With El Chapo and El Güero in prison and the Arellano Felix brothers on the run, the center of gravity of drug trafficking shifted to Juarez under the control of Amado Carrillo Fuentes. In the mid-1990s, he was one of Mexico's most influential drug traffickers. He transported innumerable tons of cocaine across the border each year and wielded such power that many journalists in Mexico dared not even print his name. Working with Amado were also El Chapo's loyal allies like El Mayo and El Azul. Therefore, when an entirely predictable feud erupted between the Arellano Felix clan and Amado's team, including the remnants of El Chapo's group, it became somewhat difficult for El Chapo to maintain contact with his men on the outside. Martinez, who had visited him about 6 months after his 1993 arrest, could no longer go in person due to the Arellano Felix militants hiding in Guadalajara. El Chapo had a cell phone, but when he needed to transmit important messages without fear of interception, he was forced to rely on his brother-in-law who visited him. During that period, outside, political changes were taking place, both in Mexico and the United States. In 1992, the White House was occupied by Bill Clinton, the first Democrat in 12 years. The Clinton administration largely maintained the status quo on drugs and crime and upheld the Reagan and Bush administration's stance on an all-out war on drugs. The DEA and the U.S. drug war had changed in the years since undercover agents like Kiki Camarena roamed Mexico with little support. The Soviet Union at that time had ceased to be a threat to America, and freed-up forces needed to be directed somewhere. The DEA became a powerful and influential organization with a large number of technical and human resources. On the 2nd of July 2000, the people of Mexico made history by voting to elect Vicente Fox Quesada as their next president. It was the first time since 1929 that the presidency was not occupied by the PRI or its predecessors. It felt like a breath of fresh air for the country. The growth of democratic elections and successful opposition parties in Mexico was, undoubtedly, a true breakthrough for ordinary citizens. However, for drug traffickers, this meant something completely different. The networks built over decades between them and the PRI government were crumbling. And now, for successful operations, they needed to revise their methods. More and more drug traffickers were breaking their ties with state power structures that provided protection and began creating their own. More traffickers began forming private militias and openly fighting their competitors, instead of relying on corrupt police and soldiers to arrest rivals. The country was on the eve of one of the darkest periods in its history, an era of large-scale violence and chaos from which it has not yet emerged. But when Fox took power on the 1st of December, 2000, None of this was known. Hope for Mexico's dawn was stronger than ever. Less than 2 months later, El Chapo turned these hopes into ridicule. After 8 years of imprisonment, El Chapo Guzmán decided he no longer wanted to be in prison. So, on the 19th of January, 2001, he walked out, and no one deemed it necessary to stop him. But let's take things in order. In April 1999, a new team of guards and administrators led by Damaso López Núñez arrived at Puente Grande. When Damaso López arrived, El Chapo immediately began showering the new deputy security director with money and gifts. With Damaso and his men under control, El Chapo could communicate more freely than ever with his allies, who worked to keep him in play and had access to virtually every imaginable luxury. His legal position also improved. When a judge overturned his conviction for the archbishop's murder, the press speculated that he might not be in prison for long. However, the government sought to quash such speculation. In reality, El Chapo didn't need the help of the judicial system, as he had long been preparing the ground for his release. He had planned his escape with a close circle of accomplices. Several events prompted El Chapo to attempt his escape. First, in September 2000, Damaso López resigned from his post amidst growing rumors of a corruption investigation at the prison. His resignation threatened to leave El Chapo without access to his usual lifestyle and constant communication with associates. Then, in early January, the new president Vicente Fox ordered an investigation into corruption at Puente Grande. In response to Fox's directive, officials ordered the transfer of El Chapo and other notorious drug traffickers to another wing of the prison. And Chapo understood that things were taking a bad turn. Finally, the day before El Chapo's escape, the most frightening event occurred. On the 18th of January 2001, Mexico's Supreme Court ruled that the extradition of prisoners like El Chapo would continue, provided the United States promised they would not be executed. Since the days of Pablo Escobar, the only thing that truly terrified the narco baron was rotting in an American prison. Chapo concluded it was time to end his detention. On the 19th of January, around 8 o'clock in the evening, Guard El Chiito rolled a laundry cart toward El Chapo's cell. El Chapo squeezed inside, hiding among a pile of sheets and blankets. As soon as his diminutive passenger was well hidden, El Chiito began a nervous journey from the cell to the prison gates, while El Chapo held his breath under the linens. Puente Grande is divided into 8 different security blocks, each separated from the other by checkpoints called rhombuses, 4-sided glass enclosures where a guard sat, opening locked doors on each side of the rhombus with the push of a button. To reach the prison gates, El Chiito had to guide the laundry cart through several of these rhombuses. At each rhombus, El Chapo felt the slight click of the door opening, knowing he was one step closer to freedom. After passing all the rhombuses, El Chiito with the cart headed straight for his car. And then El Chapo broke free from the pile of dirty laundry, climbed out of the cart, and dove into the trunk. Closing the trunk lid, Chiito slid into the driver's seat and drove as calmly as possible toward the last checkpoint, where a guard stood by the raised metal gates, the final barrier between El Chapo and freedom. The guard quickly inspected the car's interior and waved his colleague through without checking the trunk. Soon, Chiito watched the prison recede in his rearview mirror. In her book Narcoland, writer Anabel Hernandez claims that the laundry cart story was a fabrication, concocted after the escape to conceal the true account, which was that El Chapo simply walked out the prison's front door. However, the laundry cart theory, which has been repeatedly recounted in court testimonies by several of El Chapo's former accomplices, has never refuted the fact that El Chapo managed to escape from Puente Grande due to rampant corruption. So, it could very well be true. Regardless of whether El Chapo was whisked away by El Chiito or walked out on his own 2 feet in a stolen guard uniform, it was his ability to corrupt the right people that enabled his escape. Over 500 police officers launched a statewide manhunt in Jalisco for Joaquín Guzmán Loera, but he seemed to have vanished into thin air. For President Fox, the escape was a punch to the gut. It was proof that corruption had permeated every level of his country's criminal justice system and political life. Rumors and accusations repeatedly surfaced that officials in Vicente Fox's administration had helped orchestrate El Chapo's escape, purportedly as part of a plan to return to the days of federal control over drug trafficking. Some journalists directly accused Fox of supporting El Chapo's return to power, partly citing the swift demise of the Arellano Felix brothers after his release as corroborating albeit indirect evidence. Indeed, much evidence, found even in our present day, connects the administration to Chapo and Mayo through invisible threads of corruption. But as always in Mexico, it is impossible to prove anything with certainty. Chapo, meanwhile, after his escape, successfully reached a temporary hideout in the state of Querétaro, from where he was picked up by helicopter by El Mayo. They then traveled by car to Mexico City. As they entered the capital's outskirts, a prearranged escort of municipal police and federal agents positioned themselves on both sides of the car, ensuring the valuable passenger arrived safely at his destination. Upon arriving at a house in the prestigious Lomas residential neighborhood, El Mayo and El Chapo began making plans for the future. They needed to eliminate competitors. They wanted to do so at the hands of the DEA. The fact is that as early as 1997, Chapo, through a complex scheme, had contacted an agent named Bond at Puente Grande to denounce the hated Arellano and Palma, who, sensing power during Chapo's detention, had attempted to become the boss. This time, through the same complex scheme, which involved his second wife Griselda, who apparently desired an American visa, Arturo Guzman, also known as El Pollo, contacted Bond. But under pressure, El Pollo was forced to be arrested, and for several years Chapo tried to free his brother, who 3 years later, on the 31st of December 2004, was nonetheless killed in prison as revenge against El Chapo. In the weeks and months following his escape, El Chapo held a series of meetings with his allies. Some of El Chapo's oldest friends and partners were present, including Mayo Zambada, his brother El Rey, the Beltran Leyva brothers, and Juan José El Azul de Paragosa Morena, as well as Ignacio Nacho Coronel. El Chapo's position was precarious. The Arellano Felix brothers, despite all his efforts, still controlled Tijuana, and the sluggish war had occasionally flared up during the 8 years he had spent in prison. Amado Carrillo Fuentes was dead, and although his brother Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, also known as El Viceroy, the Viceroy, still controlled Juarez, the Sinaloa Federation's relations with the younger Carrillo were cold, and, worse still, El Chapo was running out of money. Despite his loyalty, El Mayo had not been the most adept manager during El Chapo's time in prison, and the empire he governed at the time of his 1993 arrest had significantly shrunk. The Beltran Leyva family had offered him enormous help during his incarceration, but he didn't want to work for them. He wanted to manage everything himself. In one of the early meetings at El Mayo's ranch, he made it clear he fully supported El Chapo. "I am with you 100%, El Mayo said. "I will help you with everything you need, and every kilogram of cocaine I receive from Colombia, I will give you half. So for now, take care of yourself and stay hidden." And they found the safest hideout in all of Mexico. It was, of course, Sinaloa. When El Chapo returned to La Tuna in 2001 and began rebuilding his empire, he was obsessed with revenge. Ramon Arellano Felix was first on his list. Police officers working for El Mayo tracked him down in Mazatlan on the 10th of February 2002 while trying to stop him on the street. Ramon opened fire on the police and fled, then attempted to escape. The police killed him on the street. He was one of Mexico's most wanted men after El Chapo. Ramon had fake documents on him, and the day after he was killed, someone showed up at the morgue and abducted his body. Ramon's identity was only confirmed after investigators scraped some of his blood from the pavement and performed a DNA test. Next was Benjamin Arellano Felix. Working with the DEA, Mexican police almost tracked Benjamin by following his daughter, who was undergoing treatment in the United States, and found him by tracing phone calls. On the 9th of March, 2002, police raided the house where Benjamin was located and took him into custody safely. This is how the leaders of the Tijuana boss family exited the stage. The other family members remained a force in Tijuana for many years, but they never achieved the same level of power and never posed the same threat to El Chapo and his allies. With his base in Sinaloa, El Chapo now oversaw the rebuilding and restructuring of his and El Mayo's empire, the alliances of various gangs and factions they called the Federation. At a meeting held in early 2002, El Chapo, El Mayo, and others gathered with Amado Carrillo's younger brother and agreed to continue working together. Of particular interest to El Chapo, El Mayo, and the Carrillo Fuentes family was the common route traffickers used to smuggle cocaine by train to Texas and then to Chicago. El Chapo and his allies had been transporting cocaine into the United States by rail since the late 1980s. Around 1997, El Mayo and the Carrillo Fuentes family ceded control of the route to a trafficker named Tirsa Martinez Sanchez. Soon, Tirsa coordinated ton-sized shipments belonging to the Carrillo Fuentes family, El Mayo, Beltran Leyva, and El Chapo, who continued to buy stakes in the shipments from prison. The route provided a relatively safe way to smuggle large volumes of drugs across the border. As innovative as El Chapo's tunnels were, moving products through them required complex logistics involving a large number of workers. Trains, on the other hand, required less effort, and a rail car with a secret compartment could hold a 1.5-ton load of cocaine. With minimal inspection, the train crossed the border from Nuevo Laredo in Tamaulipas to Laredo in Texas. From Laredo, the trains headed north to Chicago or New York, where the tanker car was unloaded into a warehouse rented under the name of a shell company. In addition to secrecy and large volumes, delivering cocaine north on freight trains offered another bonus. Because the loads were sealed in secret compartments, El Chapo's men did not need a significant presence in the areas through which the drugs passed. There were no warehouses to unload the shipments, and thus he saw no need to pay a tax to whoever controlled that particular border crossing. Just as he had done in Tijuana in the early 1990s, El Chapo decided to start sending cocaine shipments through the Nuevo Laredo and Matamoros border crossings in the northeastern state of Tamaulipas. By doing so, he disregarded the power of the so-called Gulf Cartel, which controlled the plaza in Tamaulipas. Chapo clashed with a group of assassins, by then much better organized and ready to shed blood. The group, widely known as the Gulf Cartel, had emerged in the 1930s as a smuggling organization. It was founded by Juan Nepomuceno Guerra. Guerra's nephew, Juan Garcia Abrego, took the reins in the 1970s, capitalizing on the marijuana boom and the long-established smuggling routes of his uncle. It was one of Mexico's strongest independent clans, and it was the only non-Sinaloa faction. Garcia Abrego had forged the closest ties with the presidential administration, and during Gallardo's legendary division of plazas, Garcia Abrego retained his. He was a respected community member whose opinion was taken into account. It is known that Abrego allowed the Guadalajara cartel to transport drugs through his territory, and Gallardo respected his power. The DEA estimated that Garcia Abrego's network generated up to $10 billion in profits annually. Garcia Abrego's military assistant was a man named Ociel Cardenas Guillen, whose nickname, the Friend Killer, suggests how he gained and maintained power. Cardenas awaited the opportune moment to seize power, and soon such a moment arrived. Garcia Abrego maintained close ties with President Carlos Salinas, but the subsequent administration was less tolerant of him and issued an arrest warrant. Federal agents arrested Garcia Abrego in 1996, and he was quickly extradited to the United States, where he is currently serving 11 consecutive life sentences. After a brief power struggle, control of the Gulf network passed to the Friend Killer. While Garcia Abrego and his uncle were respected figures with connections, Cardenas Guillen was of humble origins and could not rely on family ties to impose his will and maintain order. To control his territory, he needed an army. Cardenas's first major mercenary was former military officer Arturo Guzmán de Sena. He arrived in Tamaulipas in 1997, adopting the code name Z1 in honor of the radio frequency used by his special unit. He named his new team of enforcers Los Zetas. In time, the Zetas split from the Gulf Cartel and became one of the most violent organized crime groups Mexico had ever seen. But in the early 2000s, when El Chapo decided to start shipping cocaine through Nuevo Laredo, the Zetas were content with public displays of violence on behalf of their boss Cardenas. Daytime shootouts, massacres, and bodies dumped in town squares became part of daily life in areas where the Zetas operated, even as other areas of Mexico became notably safer. By 2002, El Chapo, El Mayo, and other Sinaloa leaders maintained good relations with the Gulf Cartel and the Zetas, but El Chapo began looking northeast for expansion, perhaps due to its key rail and road infrastructure. He sent Arturo Beltran Leyva to Tamaulipas to start recruiting people locally to coordinate smuggling and prepare for war. Arturo's most notorious assistant in this area was an American named Edgar Valdez Villarreal, who had been smuggling marijuana and cocaine into Texas since the late 1990s. Nicknamed La Barbie for his blonde hair, he dedicated himself to creating a paramilitary force called Los Negros, which he and his Sinaloa patrons hoped could oppose the Zetas. Tensions escalated in Nuevo Laredo, where La Barbie and other independent traffickers who paid tribute to the Gulf Cartel began challenging the authority of Cardenas and the Zetas. As El Chapo and Beltran Leyva began to advance, the lucrative plaza was poised to erupt. As often happens in the murky conflicts between organized crime groups, the precise event that triggered the war for Nuevo Laredo is difficult to pinpoint. Some say the conflict began when La Barbie killed the brother of a Zetas Commandos member. Others argue that it was the Zetas' murder of an independent trafficker that prompted other independent traffickers, like La Barbie, to side with El Chapo and the Beltran Leyva family. It is not improbable that the situation was also exacerbated by the fact that on the 14th of March, 2003, Mexican soldiers in Matamoros arrested Cardenas after a prolonged shootout, which immediately created a power vacuum. By August 2003, Tamaulipas and its surroundings were convulsed by daily violence. At least 45 murders and at least 40 kidnappings occurred in a city that once enjoyed relative stability. On the 1st of August, a heavily armed convoy of La Barbie's men opened fire on Federal Investigation Agency agents with automatic weapons and rocket launchers, turning downtown Nuevo Laredo into a war zone for nearly 1 hour. The brutality and public nature of the ensuing violence were unprecedented in Mexico. Bodies left on the street with warnings to rivals, severed heads rolled into crowded public places, videos of torture and murder. As El Chapo and his associates battled for control of Nuevo Laredo, violence was used and publicized more widely than ever before. When the Zetas made their presence felt, expanding throughout Tamaulipas and beyond, this marked the beginning of a new phase of drug trafficking, a kind of arms race, as other drug trafficking networks began forming paramilitary security forces. El Chapo was no exception. Immediately after his escape from Puente Grande, he began recruiting individuals, specifically seeking former soldiers who knew how to use weapons, interrogate, torture, and kill. All this time, El Chapo continued to regain ground. He enjoyed participating and took an active role in planning drug deliveries, new smuggling methods, and intrigues against rival drug traffickers. But he also had an innate understanding of how to work with local networks in remote locations, creating a more horizontal structure of the hierarchical pyramid that many envision when they hear the word cartel. While some smuggling groups, sometimes called cartels, for example, the Medellin and Cali cartels in Colombia or the Arellano Felix family organization, had a rather vertical structure, El Chapo's federation was organized more horizontally, with a significant portion of decision-making power granted to individual brigades in their respective regions. A lawyer perhaps provided the most comprehensive explanation of El Chapo's system. The Sinaloa cartel represented a group of people who helped each other successfully deliver cocaine shipments to the United States. Of course, he was referring to the bosses, not the small-time smugglers and fraudsters often called cartel members. This group of bosses, later to be called the Sinaloa cartel, primarily consisted of El Chapo, El Mayo, the Beltran brothers, Juan José El Azul de Paragosa Morena, and Ignacio Nacho Coronel. They had the capital to invest tens of millions of dollars at a time in cocaine shipments. They had the smuggling infrastructure to transport this cocaine north into the United States. And they had the political connections to ensure that for the most part it reached its destination without interference from law enforcement. Each had their own team of loyal gunmen, but they often shared logistics with semi-independent smuggling groups located in key places, who could unload a boat in the southern state of Chiapas, for example, or load it onto a train in Mexico City, or move it across the border in Juarez. Each had their own zone of influence, their own plaza. Arturo Beltran Leyva, Acapulco, Nacho Coronel, Guadalajara. And in each plaza, everyone had their own political and police contacts. Sometimes they worked together, sometimes they worked alone. Sometimes they pooled their money and invested in joint shipments, and sometimes they invested their own money and bought an entire batch at once. But they never approached the level of corporate organization and hierarchy so often assumed when overly imaginative narrators set out to describe drug trafficking networks, such as El Chapo's network. Thanks to partnerships with local brigades along the entire supply chain, El Chapo gained access to local expertise, and local traffickers gained access to a staggering volume of investment capital, as well as the connections El Chapo and his allies had established with high-ranking police, military, and political officials. They also continued to collaborate closely with cocaine producers in Colombia, including Juan Carlos Ramirez Abadia's organization and the Cifuentes family. Chupeta continued to work with El Chapo's friends and family throughout the 1990s, and after the escape, he re-established contact with El Chapo. At that time, in the early and mid-2000s, most cocaine arriving in Mexico came by boat, as increasingly sophisticated radar systems used by Mexican authorities in southern Mexico made the old method of large-scale illegal flights from Central America or Colombia even riskier. In 2005, Sinaloa made another attempt to conquer Matamoros with the same results. The territory resisted. Chapo's troops failed to seize it. Hundreds of people died during this attempt, forcing President Fox's administration to abandon its policy of non-intervention regarding illicit drug trafficking. Troops were deployed to Nuevo Laredo, and the U.S. consulate was closed due to the lack of security faced by American officials and citizens. Unlike the Tijuana organization, which defended its territory, but whose reaction was limited to attempts to kill Sinaloa leaders, the Gulf Cartel not only defended Nuevo Laredo with fire and sword, but also attacked Sinaloa. Violence in the early 2000s became synonymous with drug trafficking. At that time, Chapo was on the run. His brother Arturo was killed in prison, and another brother, Miguel Angel, was arrested. But the DEA agents chasing him knew this would not stop him. Having lost in the Northeast, he turned his gaze north, forging an alliance with the Flores brothers, who in 2005 returned to Mexico and settled in Guadalajara. In mid-2005, they met with Guzman in his secret mountain hideout to conclude major drug deals. The brothers conducted all their U.S. operations from the Mexican ranch, issuing orders by phone. Their network extended from the centers of Chicago to New York, Detroit, and Washington, as well as Los Angeles and Vancouver in British Columbia. On the run, Chapo lived very modestly. He constantly changed his location and made do with little, literally living in makeshift shacks. He developed genuine paranoia. He wanted the phone of everyone he came into contact with, including his many lovers, to be tapped. From 2006, a veritable war began between Sinaloa and Juarez. Chapo, in his mountain hideout, wanted to become the undisputed lord of the entire northern border. And from 2008, the conflict between Chapo and his most loyal friends, the Beltran Leyva brothers, began. The alliance between El Chapo and the brothers started to unravel on the 21st of January 2008 when a group of Mexican soldiers arrested Alfredo, also known as El Machom. Arturo Beltran accused El Chapo of this. He tried to downplay the conflict, but the tension was too high. And 3 months after El Machom's arrest on the 30th of April, it erupted. A team of federal police working for El Chapo approached a house in Culiacan to attempt to arrest or neutralize the Beltran Leyva's men. The gunmen opened fire on the police. The police returned fire, and suddenly Culiacan ignited, and military operations shifted to the streets. In the first 11 days of May, 52 murders occurred in the city. Newspapers began counting the dead, in a way reminiscent of casualty reports printed in the United States at the height of the Iraq War. In May 2008, Chapo's son, Edgar Guzman Lopez, was killed. He was gunned down in a shopping mall parking lot. On the 30th of May, a third party, the state, joined the war, conducting a series of large and brutal raids on drug-dealing points. In response, in the city of Guamuchil, armed men attacked the state ministerial police headquarters, firing automatic weapons at the building and throwing several grenades. "This is war," screamed newspaper headlines, and chilling reports of killed civilians were printed daily. The Flores brothers found themselves in a difficult situation. They had no intention of participating in the bloody war and found no better option than to become DEA informants. A very complex game began. The twins led a double life. They organized drug deliveries and then passed on information to their handlers, which led to the seizure of over 250 kilograms of cocaine and $4 million in cash. Their handlers demanded complete honesty. But if every one of their shipments ended up in the hands of federal agents, their suppliers in Mexico might start wondering why Chicago's Golden Boys had suddenly encountered such bad luck. Therefore, trying to strike a balance, the brothers continued to distribute kilograms of Sinaloa, occasionally forgetting to report it to their handlers. But they proved to be invaluable witnesses for the United States. Their testimonies and recorded conversations literally cornered the Sinaloa leaders. In the recordings, Chapo negotiated deliveries, and El Mayo discussed the import of an arsenal of weapons. In November 2008, the Flores brothers surrendered to Uncle Sam and saved their lives and those of their families. Less than 1 year later, a grand jury in Chicago issued an indictment based primarily on the recordings made by the twins, accusing El Chapo, El Mayo, and 9 other Sinaloa members of drug and arms trafficking in quantity sufficient to send them all behind bars in the United States for life. Now, authorities only needed to catch them. But the war in Sinaloa did not stop, and Juarez became the most dangerous place in the world. In 2008, almost half of the 6,000 drug-related murders recorded in Mexico occurred in Juarez. By 2010, the murder rate there was 10 times the national average. Over 99% of homicides remained unsolved, and the city morgue was so overcrowded that it began disposing of bodies in mass graves. In 2009, Arturo Beltrán Leiva was killed by Mexican Marines. For a long time, it was believed that El Chapo himself had betrayed him, but in reality, it turned out that La Barbie, who had begun collaborating with the DEA, betrayed him. In April 2010, the Associated Press published an article announcing El Chapo's victory, stating that Sinaloa was now responsible for most of the cocaine transported through Juarez. But all the arrests made by the federal police and El Chapo's victories had little impact on the daily lives of Juarez residents. 2010 was the worst year, with over 3,000 murders recorded by the end of December. El Chapo and El Mayo also did not remain unscathed. On the 22nd of October, 2008, federal police arrested El Rey Zambada after a prolonged shootout in a residential neighborhood of Mexico City, a critical blow to their operations in the capital. On the 19th of March, 2009, El Mayo's eldest son and heir, Vicente Zambada Niebla, was also arrested in the capital. In 2010, El Chapo's longtime associate, Ignacio Nacho Coronel Villarreal, died in a shootout with the Mexican army. When troops raided the house where Coronel died, they discovered a treasure trove of luxury watches, jewelry, and $7 million in cash. Coronel had cultivated an image of an old-school mafioso who respected traditions, while also being an innovator in methamphetamine production and trafficking, earning him the title of El Rey de Hielo, meaning the Ice King. Methamphetamine, cheap and relatively simple to produce in large quantities, proved to be a valuable new asset. And an even more valuable asset from Chinese suppliers would become fentanyl, and later the darknet marketplace, Steclo. But that's another story. Cocaine was attractive to Mexican drug traffickers because they didn't have to cultivate it. And with methamphetamine and fentanyl, drug traffickers didn't even have to worry about supplies from Colombia. Once they obtained the necessary chemicals, which moved easily around the world, they controlled almost the entire supply chain, from production to wholesale distribution. Methamphetamine flowed north, and cash flowed south. Coronel's death was a blow to El Chapo, but it did not prevent others under his patronage from producing the drug. However, It led to another emergence of small factions vying for dominance in the areas where Coronel once held everything together. After Coronel's death, some of his former loyalists announced the creation of a new group, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, which some years later broke away from El Chapo and became one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country under the leadership of its leader, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, also known as El Mencho. As Felipe Calderón's presidency drew to a close, it became clear that Mexican politics would still be defined by the drug war he had started in the early days of his term. Since Calderón had barely won in 2006, Juarez and Tijuana had been ravaged, and vast areas of the country had become hotbeds of kidnappings, extortion, and crime, from which peaceful citizens simply had no one to protect them. Unlike previous generations of traffickers, many of the new groups had emerged in the post-Los Zetas era and had developed a much more militarized structure and a self-defined group identity than previous traffickers, as the need to control territory and distinguish themselves from other newcomers increased. In this landscape of fragmented factions, a growing number of gangs clashed with each other for control of smuggling territory, drug trafficking, and extortion from farmers and landowners who cultivated commercial crops like avocados and limes. All this time, Chapo continued to hide. From the moment of his escape from Puente Grande, he evaded justice for 13 years. His name became shrouded in legends, and in these years he literally became a semi-mythological figure. But in 2014, as Chapo was on his way to a party in Mazatlan, he was caught. It took several years of meticulous investigation. Literally millimeter by millimeter, the Americans tightened the noose around the elusive Chapo, each time astonished by his new and increasingly sophisticated cunning. Thus, his colleague from the Colombian Cifuentes clan, Alex, hired a talented programmer named Christian Rodriguez, who created such a perfect communication system for El Chapo that agents couldn't believe it. They couldn't even decrypt the recovered BlackBerry, which might have led them to the world's most wanted criminal after bin Laden. But, as always, a combination of human factors played a role. First, they put pressure on Rodriguez, who was not a criminal at all, but still couldn't betray his boss. He simply didn't know where Chapo was because he wasn't part of the inner circle of trusted confidants. Then, through Cifuentes' assistant, who was one step away from El Chapo, they pinpointed his location and captured him. This whole story is described in detail in Alan Foyer's book, Hunting El Chapo. In the summer of 2014, El Chapo was transferred to the Altiplano maximum security prison, but even there he did not stay long. On the 11th of July, 2015, a year and a half after his capture, El Chapo's surveillance camera recorded him pacing his cell, a room with 3 concrete walls and one of metal bars, with a bed, a nightstand, and a shower with a waist-high partition. On the nightstand was a roll of toilet paper and something that looked like a smartphone. El Chapo was wearing the prison's beige uniform, and on the wall opposite his bed hung a spare shirt. After walking a couple of times from the shower to the nightstand and back, he entered the shower stall and bent over, as if to pick something up from the shower floor, the only blind spot in his cell. Then he took a couple of steps towards the bed, sat down, and took off his shoes. He remained seated there, then stood up. 4 steps, and he reached the shower and disappeared from view. Descending through a 50 by 50 centimeter opening in the shower floor, El Chapo climbed 1 meter below his cell floor via a PVC pipe ladder before descending into a tunnel, where an accomplice already awaited him on a dirt bike. They rode 1.5 kilometers to the other end of the tunnel and crawled through the exit shaft, emerging from a square opening cut into the floor of an unfinished house. Mounting an ATV, the two rode a short distance to a warehouse where they boarded a waiting SUV and drove for about 2 hours north to an airstrip in Querétaro State, where a pilot awaited to take Chapo to a safe location in Sinaloa. When guards finally came to check his cell, the only living creature left in the cell was a sparrow, which El Chapo's men had used to test the air quality in the tunnel. The escape was planned for more than 1 year, conceived during meetings between Damaso Lopez and El Chapo's sons. Starting in April 2014, Damaso Lopez and El Chapo's sons began laying the groundwork. They bought a property about 1 kilometer from the prison, where workers began digging. Then they acquired a nearby warehouse where they stored weapons and an armored pickup truck. Then they secretly brought a GPS watch into the prison, which allowed them to precisely locate El Chapo's cell so the tunnel construction team could dig in the right direction. This was one of the most famous tricks of El Chapo's career. He had made a name for himself by digging tunnels in Agua Prieta and Tijuana. He had once escaped from Marines in Culiacan through a tunnel, and now, again, he used a tunnel to bend the world to his will. The tunnel was another architectural marvel, stretching over 1 kilometer from the fake construction site under the prison walls and directly into El Chapo's shower, with lighting and ventilation suspended along its entire length. The walls were excavated to a uniform height and width from entrance to exit, with oxygen reserves placed at strategic intervals, just in case. The tunnel, whose construction cost $5 million, required the removal of over 3,000 metric tons of earth. In the spring of 2015, El Chapo's rescuers had come so close that he could hear them trying to break through the concrete, and he wasn't alone. They made so much noise that other inmates started complaining, but no one listened. When El Chapo had already slipped into the tunnel shaft and escaped, it took 18 long minutes for prison guards to check his cell and find the escape route. A delay that led to suppositions that they had been bribed. Immediately afterward, the Attorney General's office interrogated more than 24 guards and arrested 7 in connection with the prison break. President Enrique Peña Nieto was on a state visit to France when the news broke. And his reputation, after this event, hung by a thread due to El Chapo's ability to disappear from an institution that was supposed to be the country's most secure prison. But Chapo had grown older and could no longer hide for so long. In 2016, 6 months after his second epic escape, he was captured again, this time in the city of Los Mochis during an operation by Marines. President Peña Nieto then tweeted, "Mission accomplished. After 1 year of heated debates, he was extradited to the United States, where he was indicted." On the 17th of July, 2019, a few months after being found guilty, El Chapo appeared in public for the last time to hear his sentence and make a final statement. Aside from a few quiet yes and no answers during the trial, it was the first time he had spoken publicly since appearing in a video with Sean Penn in 2015. Rising from the defense table, El Chapo greeted Judge Brian Cogan and launched into a sober critique of the treatment he received in the United States. "They claim they are sending me to a prison where my name will never be spoken again," El Chapo said, pausing for the translator to repeat in English. "I take this opportunity to say that there has been no justice here." Stammering slightly, reading prepared notes, he listed the humiliations he had faced during his detention in Manhattan. "They forced me to drink dirty water. They deprived me of access to air and sunlight," he said. "It was psychological, emotional, mental torture 24 hours a day." Experts later confirmed that Chapo was in poor condition, and perhaps precisely due to the mistreatment. A few days before the verdict, the DEA announced the seizure of 20 kilograms of fentanyl in Chicago, and shortly before that, the largest fentanyl seizure in Arizona. Chapo had been in the United States for 2 years, but his case continued, as it still does today. The history of organized crime in Mexico has always been inseparable from the history of state power. Even figures like El Chapo, high-level drug traffickers, have always been merely expendable material. The best way to understand Mexican drug trafficking is as follows. Try to imagine it not as a dark sector, but as a veritable capitalist enterprise. And as a capitalist enterprise, it has always maintained corrupt and ambiguous relationships with the state. And the coercive demands and shifting priorities of U.S. foreign policy have only exacerbated this situation. Drug trafficking in Mexico is inseparable from the state. Many early drug traffickers were police officers, and many early police officers were drug traffickers. And this boundary has always been conventional and remains so. El Chapo, like many other narco barons, was born poor and had little choice about what he would become. He grew up in a world that demanded violence and rewarded only the most ruthless ambitions. As he gained power, wealth, and influence, he assumed the role of mediator between the state and the ordinary people living in the areas where he held sway. And when the state no longer needed him, he was discarded like waste material. He was not a rebel. He was not Jesus Malverde. He only wanted to be important and rich. He was not the first, and it is already clear that he will not be the last.